Welcome to The Last Hike. Today's story follows two women who treated survival as secondary to content, where documenting the moment mattered more than the danger they were stepping into. Heat, terrain, and disregard for environmental risk were replaced by filming priorities, turning a short desert stop into something far less controlled than it first appeared. Knowing how normal it felt before it went wrong gives me the chills. It was July 14, 2018, in Furnace Creek, Death Valley National Park, under an active excessive heat warning with extreme triple-digit temperatures. A silver-gray 2014 Honda Civic arrived at a visitor parking area despite the dangerous conditions. The two young women who got out of the car were really just focused on making content like that was basically the whole mindset at that moment. Kayla Renee Durst, 22, was from the Phoenix area. She grew up around extreme heat and kind of assumed that meant she could handle it better than most people. She didn't finish community college and was working part-time at a beauty counter in Tempe while also trying to grow her TikTok, which was mostly centered on desert aesthetics and lifestyle content. By mid-2018, she had a small but growing audience and a pretty clear direction for what she wanted to post more about visuals and trends than anything outdoors related. Her focus was really on content creation, not hiking or anything technical. She had been to a few popular spots in Arizona and the Grand Canyon, but only the easy paved viewpoints. She didn't really have backcountry experience, and she wasn't carrying proper hiking gear either, just basic stuff like lightweight athletic sandals that weren't made for rough desert terrain. Brianna Solano, 21, was her roommate and someone she often worked with on content. She had tried nursing school for a bit, but left before finishing. Compared to Kayla, she was a bit more cautious, but she usually just went along with whatever plans Kayla came up with when it came to trips or shoots. Her social media wasn't as big, and most of their content together ended up being posted through Kayla's account or shared collaborations. The trip to Death Valley was Kayla's idea. It came out of the growing attention around desert travel content online at the time. She had looked up locations and inspiration beforehand, mostly focusing on places that would look good on camera and fit current TikTok trends. At the end of the day, the trip was really about getting striking visuals in a place that was starting to get popular online, not about hiking experience or understanding the risks involved. I don't really see this as some dramatic thing, like they ignored everything in the moment. It feels more like they were just locked into one goal and didn't really pause to question if the place actually fit what they were trying to do. And honestly, I've seen that pattern before. Once everything starts through the camera, the environment stops being the main focus and just becomes the backdrop. In midsummer Death Valley, the valley floor sits in conditions where heat stops feeling like weather and starts acting like constant load. The basin's geography amplifies the effect. Mountain ranges trap heat, elevations sit below sea level, and the exposed desert surface offers no meaningful shade or cooling relief. A visitor center in Furnace Creek displays live temperatures and safety advisories, and rangers regularly warn visitors about outdoor exposure in peak summer. Those warnings were there, but they weren't really processed at the moment. What made the conditions easier to underestimate wasn't really a lack of information, it was more how people processed it in the moment. Death Valley actually has pretty clear warnings, but they're the kind you see on signs, boards, or advisories that just stay the same no matter what you're doing. So for visitors who are basically treating the place like a quick stop for photos rather than something physically demanding, those warnings tend to fade into the background. And from my perspective, that's really where the misread happens. You see the signs, you hear the advisories, but they don't quite land as urgent or personal at the moment. It ends up feeling like general information sitting there in the background, not something that's actively registering as personal or immediate. The gap between dangerous conditions exists, and this activity is unsafe right now is where misjudgment typically forms, especially when the planned activity is framed as a short, accessible walk rather than sustained exposure. Instead, shortly after arriving, they documented the environment on their phones, treating the extreme heat and temperature displays as part of the visual experience rather than a safety concern. They also retrieved a paper park map from a public display rack and used it to select a nearby geological feature as their destination. The selection process itself did not involve a reassessment of environmental conditions. The trail choice was based on proximity and visual interest rather than seasonal suitability or heat load. On park maps, short-distance trails in Death Valley can appear comparable to casual walking routes elsewhere, with little visual distinction between a mild-season hike and a midsummer exposure route. Without direct consultation with rangers or updated field guidance, The decision remained anchored in distance and aesthetics rather than thermal risk, reinforcing the assumption that the hike would be brief and manageable. The route they picked was shown on the map as a short, easy hike, nothing that really stood out as risky. There wasn't much mention of how different it gets in summer or how serious the heat can be. With the car's air conditioning still running, they left the parking area and just drove south along the main park road toward the trailhead, heading deeper into the valley as the temperature outside was already climbing to dangerous levels. Badwater Road runs south along the floor of Death Valley between two mountain ranges, through a landscape that is exposed, reflective, and intensely heat-retaining in midsummer. The paved road remains accessible to visitors, but the surrounding desert offers little to no relief from direct solar exposure or radiating ground heat. They traveled south with the air conditioning running and arrived at a small gravel trailhead parking area marked for a short canyon hike. One other vehicle was present, but the lot was otherwise empty. The trail begins directly from the pullout and leads into a shallow canyon with a compacted gravel surface and scattered rock. There is no meaningful shade at the start, and canyon walls remain low for some distance before offering any real cover. In mid-morning summer conditions, the air temperature was already well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, with ground surfaces significantly hotter in exposed sections. They got out of the car and pretty much started filming right away, short walking clips, wide shots of the canyon, that kind of thing. And honestly, the phones sort of ended up running the whole pace of the hike. They decided when to stop, when to start moving again, and even how they moved through each section of the trail based on what would look good on camera. They had a small shared bottle of water, about a liter total, and early on they just kind of passed it back and forth like it was enough for a quick walk.
I'm gonna be honest here, that already says a lot about how the situation was framed in their minds. More like a short content stop than something physically demanding.
There wasn't much extra gear in the car either. What they had on them was basically it. They were dressed for warm weather, not for desert conditions. So light clothing, minimal footwear, and not much protection from the ground heating up underneath them. A portable charger was left behind in the vehicle, which again shows where the focus was at the time. It wasn't really on staying out there for long or preparing for changing conditions. The phones were already in hand before they fully left the vehicle and remained active throughout the walk. They were used continuously lifted, lowered, and repositioned, shaping, pacing, and framing as they moved through the canyon. The pattern that developed was not steady hiking, but repeated stopping, adjusting angles, and recording short segments before continuing forward. Nothing in what they brought or how it was used accounted for sustained exposure to extreme heat. The focus remained on capturing the environment as it appeared, not on mitigating the conditions it created. About 15 minutes into the hike, they met the only other people they would see on the trail that day. A retired couple from Nevada, experienced desert hikers, were heading back toward the trailhead. They later told investigators they immediately noticed Kayla and Brianna were moving slowly, frequently stopping, and already showing clear signs of strain in the heat. The girls were also pausing along the trail to film short clips, repositioning themselves, adjusting angles, and capturing moments of the canyon rather than maintaining a steady hiking pace. After a brief exchange about the conditions, the couple continued on and left the trail shortly after, seeing no one else on their way out. Experienced hikers note this aligns with early-stage heat strain rather than immediate collapse. Early indicators are often subtle, including reduced walking pace, unnecessary pauses, and slower responses to conversation. These signs can appear while the person still feels cognitively normal. In the initial phase, heat stress may not be perceived as distress, increasing the risk of continued exposure instead of retreat. Their pauses started getting longer once they reached the more exposed sections of trail, and instead of steady hiking, it shifted into a stop-and-go rhythm. By the time they got to the natural bridge formation, that pattern had already fully taken over. The canyon narrowed there and offered some shade, but not enough to really take the edge off the exposure. The rock walls had been absorbing heat for days, and were still pushing it back into the narrow space, so even though the light softened, the air didn't actually feel any cooler. Kayla stayed at the bridge for a while longer, filming in a more deliberate, structured way, instead of just moving through it. The phone remained in use throughout, shifting between wide shots, close framing, and views through the arch, with no interruption for rest or reassessment. Brianna was present throughout, sometimes in front of the camera, and sometimes operating it herself, continuing to document rather than pausing.
I keep thinking about that couple's reaction here. They didn't overthink it, they didn't dramatize it, they just looked back at what was in front of them and quietly made the call to leave. In a place like this, that kind of simple judgment actually matters more than people realize.
During this time, Brianna finished the remaining water in her bottle. Once it was empty, there was no opportunity to refill it, as the trail offered no water sources at any point. By the time they left the bridge and continued deeper into the canyon, their total remaining water supply was minimal, and they were moving further into sustained exposure with no shade, no hydration source, and no indication that conditions were improving. The maintained trail ends at the bridge, marked by a sign indicating that anything beyond it is unmaintained canyon terrain. The canyon continues regardless, narrowing, deepening, and becoming more enclosed as the walls rise and the footing grows looser and less defined. There is no physical barrier preventing further movement, only the absence of maintenance and guidance. Beyond the bridge, the environment creates a misleading shift in perception. The higher canyon walls reduce direct overhead sun in places, and the enclosed space can feel marginally cooler at first exposure. But the thermal conditions do not actually improve. The rock faces continue to radiate stored heat, and the reduced airflow inside the canyon limits any real dissipation.
I've seen this kind of shift before in environments like this, the moment where reduced sunlight gets mistaken for reduced danger. But the heat doesn't actually ease up, it just changes how it's delivered.
The result is not relief, but a different form of sustained heat load, less direct, more trapped. Brianna continued past the sign behind Kayla. She followed the same pattern she had been in since the start. Kayla moved first, framed the moment, and set the direction. Brianna adjusted, supported, and often occupied the frame herself. Decisions about where to go and what to capture were effectively made through Kayla's movement and pacing, and Brianna's role remained responsive rather than leading. As they moved deeper, the behavior that had started as casual documenting became more continuous. Stops were no longer just pauses for rest, but repeated moments of repositioning, changing angles, redoing shots, adjusting framing, and reattempting short clips as the canyon kept changing visually around them. Movement and filming started to overlap until there was barely any separation between traveling and producing content. They eventually progressed several hundred meters beyond the maintained section before stopping for an extended period. By that point, their movement had slowed significantly, and the rhythm of hiking had been replaced almost entirely by intermittent filming and short pauses that grew longer each time they stopped. At some point in this stretch, Brianna lowered herself onto a flat rock surface and did not immediately stand again. At this stage, physiological strain typically transitions from performance degradation to system-level failure progression. The distinction between fatigue and heat injury becomes increasingly blurred from an external perspective, as both present as slowed movement and prolonged rest. However, in extreme environmental heat, rest does not function as recovery. The absence of cooling mechanisms means that metabolic heat continues to accumulate even during inactivity, particularly when surrounding surfaces remain hot enough to radiate energy back into the body. She remained out of active motion while Kayla continued further ahead, still filming portions of the canyon walls and looking deeper into the narrowing terrain. By this point, their responses to the heat were no longer unfolding in exactly the same way. Brianna appeared to be slowing first, spending longer periods stationary, and no longer matching Kayla's movement through the canyon. Kayla, meanwhile, continued pushing forward despite showing signs of impairment herself.
That's something I find particularly unsettling about severe heat illness. It doesn't always stop people immediately. A person can still be moving and making decisions while their ability to judge the situation is quietly and slowly getting worse.
Whatever was happening between them at that point, the available evidence suggests they did not leave the area together. The human body keeps its core temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it mainly relies on sweating and evaporation to cool itself down. Under normal conditions, that system works pretty well because the air around you is usually cooler than your skin, so heat can actually move away from the body. But in places where the air temperature goes above skin temperature, which can happen pretty regularly in Death Valley during peak summer, that whole balance flips. Instead of releasing heat, the body starts to take it in from the environment. Sweating still happens, but whether it actually helps depends completely on how fast that moisture can evaporate.
I usually think of it as the point where the body's cooling system is still trying to do its job, but the environment isn't really cooperating anymore.
In extreme desert heat, sweat evaporates rapidly, accelerating dehydration without providing meaningful cooling. As fluid levels drop, sweat production diminishes, and the body's ability to regulate temperature collapses further. Once that process begins, core temperature can rise quickly, and heat illness can progress into heat stroke in a relatively short period under sustained exposure. The progression of heat illness in conditions like this usually isn't something a person notices right away. Early on, it shows up in small ways: slower movement, more frequent stops, and kind of a narrowing of focus that's easy to miss in the moment. Thinking doesn't just stop, but it starts to feel less flexible without you really realizing it. So even when it would still be possible to slow down, turn back, back or look for shade, that adjustment often doesn't happen simply because the impairment hasn't fully registered yet. Based on the reconstruction of phone data, movement patterns, and final known positions, Kayla and Brianna likely began attempting to return toward the trailhead after an extended period beyond the maintained trail. By that point, they had only a minimal amount of water remaining between them and were still several tenths of a mile from the car. Ambient temperatures were near their peak, and the ground surface remained intensely hot under direct sun. Their movement back was slower and less continuous than their initial ascent, marked by reduced pacing and longer pauses between stretches of walking. Between the bridge and the trailhead, the environment stays completely exposed the entire way back. The return walk from roughly 0.85 miles out would normally take a healthy adult about 15 to 20 minutes on relatively even ground, but the natural bridge trail is not even terrain. It is loose gravel, scattered rock, and uneven transitions in elevation that are manageable at baseline but become increasingly significant under physiological strain. As heat illness progresses, the problem is no longer just endurance, it becomes coordination. Foot placement becomes less precise. Small changes in grade require more effort than the body can reliably produce. What would normally be minor adjustments turn into repeated interruptions in movement. In extreme heat, the body is failing to cool itself, and it may gradually lose the cognitive and motor control needed to correct for that failure. Sweating likely began to diminish significantly during this return phase. Once sweat production drops off in sustained high heat, it is not a sign of recovery, it is a sign that the system is no longer able to regulate temperature. From that point, core temperature rises without a meaningful counterbalance. The environment offered no mitigation. Between the bridge and the trailhead, there is no water, no shade, and no shelter, and during that entire window, no other hikers entered the trail. The parking area remained quiet, and the vehicle they arrived in stayed in place, unattended and unremarked upon for hours.
What always sticks with me here is how normal everything would still look from the outside. An empty trail, a parked car, and no obvious sign that anything inside that stretch was going wrong.
At that point, the body is no longer regulating temperature in a reliable way, and performance starts breaking down in uneven stages rather than all at once. Early signs may have included slowed movement, intermittent pauses, and reduced awareness of pace and direction. In this state, decision-making often becomes unreliable, and the distinction between rest and continuation begins to blur. At a certain point in this progression, movement typically becomes inconsistent, short bursts of walking, followed by longer periods of stillness. Whether they experienced any final sustained attempt to continue is unknown. What is documented is where their movement ultimately ceased. The afternoon in Death Valley continued in the same sustained, unbroken heat that defines midsummer in the basin. Air temperatures peaked near 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the surrounding area, and the exposed valley floor held even higher surface heat where sunlight struck directly. With no cloud cover and minimal wind, there was little variation and conditions only continuous, radiating heat held between the mountains. No hikers came onto the natural bridge trail during that stretch, so the canyon just kind of stayed the same, quiet, still, and untouched. The trail, the rock around it, even the parking area didn't really change at all. The silver Civic was still sitting in the pullout the whole time, exactly where they left it, untouched and unattended. At that point in the afternoon, conditions in the valley had begun to ease only in the most technical sense. The air temperature had dropped slightly from its peak, but the environment remained dangerously hot by any standard, with surfaces still retaining and radiating heat from hours of full sun exposure. The canyon system itself held that heat longer, its rock walls acting as slow-releasing thermal mass even as direct solar intensity began to soften.
Personally, I don't put much weight on the fact that the peak temperature has passed. Everything around them was still hot, and that's what mattered.
The camera kept being used, but less frequently, with longer gaps between recordings and more time spent stationary. The last recorded moments captured only fragments of the canyon, brief, unsteady clips of rock, light, and movement through tight space before the pattern of filming stopped altogether. After that point, there was no further documented activity from either of them that day. By the final segment of their movement through the canyon, coordination between pace and decision-making had likely become inconsistent. Movement patterns in this phase of heat illness often shift away from continuous travel into fragmented intervals, short periods of walking, interrupted by longer stops that are no longer strictly voluntary recovery points, but responses to physical limitation. In such a state, group synchronization also tends to break down, with individuals no longer maintaining shared pacing or mutual awareness in a reliable way. The The family from southern Utah came onto the trail pretty calmly, like it was just another short walk they'd done before. Nothing about it really felt urgent to them at the time. The route was short, familiar, and the kind of thing they'd normally be able to handle without thinking too much about it. They only went a little ways in before the father stopped. Something up ahead caught his attention and kind of broke that steady rhythm of walking. He went forward on his own to take a closer look, then almost immediately turned back and told the rest of the family to stay put right there. Kayla Renee Durst was found on the trail, unresponsive and face down, approximately within sight of the trailhead. She was no longer in motion and showed no visible signs of responsiveness. One hand was extended forward, still loosely holding a phone that had likely entered thermal shutdown. Her footwear showed signs of extreme thermal stress, consistent with prolonged contact with hot ground, including partial separation of the sole from the sandal structure. This type of failure is conditional, resulting from the combination of extreme ground temperatures, the abrasive nature of the canyon gravel, and the material stress of repeated foot strikes under physiological strain. She had no visible supplies remaining. The family withdrew immediately without going deeper into the canyon, unaware another person had entered the area with Kayla. They returned to the parking lot and contacted emergency services after initial signal instability, reporting an unresponsive individual on the trail. They remained at the trailhead as instructed while awaiting responders.
I keep thinking about that moment with the father. The fact that he didn't try to explain it or even process it out loud with them. He just saw enough in those few seconds and made the call to stop everything.
Furnace Creek Rangers arrived later that afternoon, followed by County EMS. A staged entry protocol was used due to extreme heat conditions before a team proceeded on foot into the canyon. Kayla was located first approximately 800 feet from the trailhead and was declared deceased shortly after assessment. Search personnel later located Brianna Solano deeper along the route near a natural bridge formation in a collapsed seated position beside an empty water container. Both individuals showed no signs of trauma or animal involvement, only severe heat-related injury consistent with hyperthermia. Both individuals were confirmed deceased at the scene, with investigators determining that death had occurred hours before discovery. Both deaths were classified as environmental hyperthermia caused by extreme heat exposure. Autopsies confirmed no underlying medical conditions and negative toxicology. Investigators concluded contributing factors included inadequate water, unsuitable footwear for ground temperatures, lack of shade, and insufficient environmental preparation. The canyon remained open afterward under continued heat advisories, with officials emphasizing the outcome as the result of cumulative environmental and behavioral factors leading to rapid physiological collapse under extreme desert heat. The medical examiner's autopsies confirmed hyperthermia as the cause of death in both individuals. Park authorities' review and incident reconstruction aligned with these findings, and the case was formally closed as an environmental heat-related fatality with no enforcement actions taken.